Hello, my name is Nigel Thorne and I have concerns about the Welsh Government's RSE Code and guidance that has been published for schools to form the basis of their RSE curriculum. I also have concerns about the removal of the parental right to withdraw a child from RSE lessons. On 22nd December 2022, Mrs Justice Stein ruled in favour of the Welsh Government in a legal case brought by concerned parents. In a summary of the judgment, the judge wrote, "There was a disjunct between the actual contents of the code and guidance and the claimant's allegations. On analysis of those texts, the court concluded that the contention that they fall foul of the rule against indoctrination was misconceived, and both documents complied with the pluralism requirement." I humbly disagree with the judge. The RSE Code and guidance has been driven by Professor Emma Renold, an academic from Cardiff University, who has been highly influential in the Welsh Government. Professor Renold is highly invested in queer theory, specifically gender theory, promoted by American academic Judith Butler. Gender theory aims to manipulate language in order to break down the distinctions between males and females. Queer theorists believe that breaking down these distinctions is liberating and will help to undermine the heterosexual matrix, a perception that to be normal, a boy must be masculine and sexually attracted to girls, and girls must be feminine and sexually attracted to boys. This strategy is known as the queering of the gender binary. Professor Renold's success in queering sex education in Wales has been recognised internationally. She is on the board of the Queering Education Research Institute, an organisation whose mission is to support the creation of TQ youth-affirming schools through applying sociological approaches to understanding education and educational environments. In gender theory, rather than being a material reality, sex is regarded as a social construct. Hence, in the cross-cutting themes for designing your curriculum page on the Hub website, the word sex is defined as being attributed to someone on the basis of primary sex characteristics, genitalia, and reproductive functions, rather than using the Oxford English Dictionary definition of sex as being the distinction between male and female. In gender theory, derived from Judith Butler's idea of performativity, gender is defined as something that is performed, with a gender identity created as a result of that performance. Hence, in the cross-cutting themes for designing your curriculum page on the Hub website, the word gender is defined as being often used to refer to whether someone identifies as male, female, or non-binary, rather than using the Oxford English Dictionary definition where gender is a synonym for sex. So the word gender has been redefined and moved away from the material reality of the body into the subjective feeling of the mind, with the words male and female becoming archetypes for people who perform masculinity and femininity, respectively. Those boys who don't perform masculinity are not really boys, and those girls who don't perform femininity are not really girls. Jay Stewart, the Chief Executive Officer of Gendered Intelligence, a trans lobby group, is a lesbian but transitioned to a trans man in her mid-20s. In the book, Trans Britain, Our Journey from the Shadows, he declares, "Queer theory was the roadmap to my own self-understanding." Stuart explains the factors that caused him to seek transition.
I am a trans man, which means I was assigned female at birth, raised as a girl, and then later on in my mid-20s, I came to a kind of a realisation that I felt more masculine and that actually the word man was more applicable to me.
So, in the teaching of children, the Welsh Government have mandated that the dictionary definitions of the words sex and gender are replaced with ones that are derived from queer theory. In an interview with BBC broadcaster Stephen Nolan, the former mayor of Bangor, Owen Hurcombe, explains what it means to be non-binary.
So, Owen, obviously, in this podcast, we're trying to reach out to lots of different people, including people that might not have thought too deeply about this before. So, you're non-binary. Tell me what that means to you.
Yes, so non-binary will obviously mean different things to different people who are part of our community, because fundamentally, being non-binary means you're just not a man or a woman. But within that, there's lots of variations. So you'll have people who are agender, for example, they don't have a gender. You'll have people who are gender fluid. You'll have people who are gender queer and things like that. And you'll have people like myself who use a mixture of these labels to express our identity outside of the male and female binary. And that's simply what it means. So it's not one thing. It's just the way that we describe being not male or not female and being something completely different.
And how were you biologically born?
Well, I mean, that, in my personal view, the biological, what you're identified biologically at birth really doesn't come into it. I mean, you can't look at somebody and know for certain. I mean, some people say, yes, you can. What about genitalia? People can have different relations to their genitalia than you'd understand. Some women have penises, some men have vaginas, some non-binary people have penises, some non-binary people have vaginas, and people can change that if they feel they need to. But equally, the other thing that people say is, what about chromosomes? I don't know my own chromosomes. Many people don't know their own chromosomes, and it's really, when you are talking about gender, biological sex doesn't really come into it. The only person that needs to know is any doctor you're seeing, in case there's, health risks more commonly associated with one of the, not that there's only two biological sexes, because of course you've got intersex people as well, but that's the only time it really comes into it, so it doesn't really have any reflection on gender.
I by no means want to in any way be offensive today, so the questioning is more based on, maybe I'm from a particular generation or whatever. So
I understand, and I'm not saying, that I found that an offensive question or anything. I understand why you're asking it, especially when we are doing the outreach.
Sure. So what I want to understand from you is help me understand how, if I look at a human being and they've got a penis, they're a man. I know they don't have ovaries. I know they will not grow breasts. So how is that not a man?
Well, it's not a man because that's not what being male means. I mean, there are lots of different ways of being lots of different things, and some men do have penises and some men don't, and it's not about that. I mean, to define gender as, do you have the capability of getting pregnant, or as some people do you sit down or stand up to pee, is just ridiculous. It's so much more complicated than that. The way it works is how individuals relate to it, and I know that can be a concept that's hard for people who haven't ever questioned their gender to understand. People can often think, well, how can somebody relate to a gender that isn't what they were assigned at birth? And I can understand that. I don't know what it's like to be cisgender, just as a cisgender person doesn't know what it's like to be non-binary. And it's about having that conversation and that understanding that there are differences in the world, and you just have to respect that. And it's not hurting anyone to accept that some men don't have penises and there are also non-binary people. It causes no harm.
But if we are diluting the definition of what it means to be male or what it means to be female, then does that not, by its very point, mean that there's total confusion, that there's no worth in the word male or female? What is a male? If a male is not someone who has the genitalia and the physical characteristics of what society understands is male, then what is male anymore? Is it anything that somebody wants it to be?
Well, I mean, yeah, pretty much. It's how you feel inside, and it's how you express that to the world when you're ready to come out if you are a trans guy. And it's not diluting anything. It's simply meaning that you're just not the stereotypical. I mean, more and more people in today's day and age are coming out as trans and non-binary because we're getting the visibility and the confidence and the safeguarding measures to do so. But the vast majority of the population are still going to be, and always have been and always will be, cisgender. And it's not diluting anything to just accept that trans and non-binary people are a part of society and are the gender we tell you are.
In an essay, philosopher Rachel Reilly-Cooper describes the intellectual incoherence of this view. If gender is a spectrum, that means it's a continuum between two extremes, and everyone is located somewhere along that continuum. I assume the two ends of the spectrum are masculinity and femininity. Is there anything else that they could possibly be? Once we realise this, it becomes clear that everybody is non-binary, because absolutely nobody is pure masculinity or pure femininity. Of course, some people will be closer to one end of the spectrum, while others will be more ambiguous and float around the centre. But even the most conventionally feminine person will demonstrate some characteristics that we associate with masculinity and vice versa. I would be happy with this implication because despite possessing female biology and calling myself a woman, I do not consider myself a two-dimensional gender stereotype. I am not an ideal manifestation of the essence of womanhood, and so I am non-binary, just like everybody else. However, those who describe themselves as non-binary are unlikely to be satisfied with this conclusion, as their identity as non-binary person depends upon the existence of a much larger group of so-called binary cisgender people who are incapable of being outside the arbitrary masculine-feminine genders dictated by society. And here we have an irony about some people insisting that they and a handful of their fellow gender revolutionaries are non-binary. In doing so, they create a false binary between those who conform to the gender norms associated with their sex and those who do not. In reality, everybody is non-binary. We all actively participate in some gender norms, passively acquiesce with others, and positively rail against others still. So to call oneself non-binary is in fact to create a new false binary. It also often seems to involve, at least implicitly, placing oneself on the more complex and interesting side of that binary, enabling the non-binary person to claim to be both misunderstood and politically oppressed by the binary cisgender people. Owen Hercombe is an articulate speaker. He is certainly milking the narrative that non-binary people are misunderstood and politically oppressed. Helen Mary Jones is a senior Plaid Cymru politician who has served as Shadow Minister for Education in the Welsh Government and Deputy Director of Wales's Equal Opportunities Commission. For 12 years, she was a member of the National Assembly and spent much of that time on the Equality Committee. She also worked for a National Youth Association where she helped to set up a countrywide network for young trans people. Helen Mary Jones was invited to speak at a Women's Place UK meeting in Cardiff in April 2018. The original venue was forced to cancel the planned meeting after protests by trans activists. Jones expressed her concern about both the number of girls seeking transition and the proposed reform to the Gender Recognition Act.
So I've been asked to start this evening by just saying a little bit about who I am and why I'm supporting the demands of Women's Place UK. My name's Helen Mary Jones. Some of you know me. I have been in past lives the Deputy Director of the Equal Opportunities Commission in Wales. For 12 years, I was a member of the National Assembly and spent a lot of that time serving on the Equality Committee. I think I can safely say that, like many of you here, I've given a lifetime towards campaigning for equality and social justice, not only for women's rights, but for the rights of other traditionally excluded groups. And for me, that has always included trans people. In a previous role, I worked for a national youth work organisation, and we established a national network for trans young people because they had come to us saying that they didn't feel included in those youth work provisions that were supposed to be LGBT, and they felt that the T wasn't included. I worked with my colleagues with those young people over a period of several years, and that included creating opportunities for them to talk directly to Welsh ministers about their concerns, about their access to services. Anybody who tries to tell you that Women's Place UK is a transphobic movement, I can tell you now that I would not be in this room if that was the case, and I'm sure that's true of every single one of us here. But that doesn't mean to say that over time I haven't experienced disquiet. I became concerned in my previous role about the numbers of young, non-gender conforming women, the girls that we would have called when I was young tomboys, who were feeling so uncomfortable with themselves that they felt that the only way to achieve that comfort, they couldn't be happy to be gender non-conforming girls, the only way that they could achieve that comfort with themselves was to transition to the opposite sex. And I began to wonder how much of that was just that, you know, when people can talk more openly about these issues, people can be themselves, and just as we've seen with lesbian and gay people, they can come out and they can be themselves. How much of this rise, particularly in girls identifying as trans, was to do with that, it being easier for them to do it, and how much of it was to do with how incredibly difficult it is to be a teenage girl in our pornified, hideous culture where everything is photographed every 5 seconds, where if you don't get this number of likes on Instagram, where you are nothing, where you can't get away from the bullies at school because they'll find you at home on social media. I started to ask myself some questions. It wasn't my place to ask then those questions of those young people. But I think that those are some questions that we need to think about. We need to live in a world, I think, where we don't expect little girls to be this and little boys to be that. Children, young people, all of us ought to be allowed to be ourselves.
Owen Hercombe was annoyed by Helen Mary Jones's interventions. In an act that further enraged trans activists, Jones retweeted an innocuous tweet from Professor Rosa Friedman, who is a Jew. In evident frustration, Professor Friedman tweeted, "Whatever your position on sex and gender identity, please stop equating this with the Holocaust." Helen Mary Jones was disciplined. She apologised and agreed to undertake training. Her apology did little to pacify Owen Hercombe. Plaid's leader, Adam Price, defended the disciplinary action taken. Helen Mary Jones's fate was a lesson to other politicians to not dare to invoke the wrath of the woke hordes. Every Plaid Cymru candidate for the 2021 Senedd elections had to undertake training by Gendered Intelligence. Gendered Intelligence had previously given training to the Welsh Assembly. In an online article, philosopher Heather Brunskell-Evans writes, "Gendered Intelligence claims to increase knowledge of gender diversity and improve the quality of life of trans people. Dr. J. Stewart, the CEO, describes the superior intelligence about gender which underpins the organisation. Influenced by queer theory, in particular the work of Judith Butler, Stewart posits that the body has no intrinsic meaning. Rather, gender identity is a social phenomenon. Freedom lies in rejecting the heteronormative and gender-normative meanings attached to being female or male. A wellspring of possible gender identities then opens up for adoption by children, e.g. genderqueer, gender fluid, agender, binary gender, etc. Stewart claims queer philosophy has brought about a new paradigm of thought about sex and gender, one tantamount to a scientific revolution as described by the philosopher Thomas Kuhn. Applying this revolutionary knowledge to children and young people helps us to become more intelligent about gender in everyday settings and across wider society. In Stewart's view, the possible loss of future fertility and sexual function is subsidiary to the alleged progressive capacity of young people to existentially transcend their embodied existence. Stewart tells psychologists, "It is important that children and young people can experiment, change their mind, try out new styles, express themselves. The moral panic about irreversible decisions is driven by heteronormative and gender-normative assumptions. Many people change their bodies in irreversible ways. For example, tattoos and pregnancy. The reason why some adults are exercised about the decisions children and adolescents make is that there is an undercurrent in our societal thinking that trans is wrong." Stewart recommends a reversal of the orthodox adult-child role or doctor-patient role. Young people should be given more of a platform rather than less of one. And it is their insight and experience that should steer services, not vice versa. Brunskell-Evans puts the question, how could the ideology of the trans child have ever taken hold in the first place? If we truly want to answer the above question, we could reflect on the extent to which defining sex and gender has fallen to gendered intelligence, along with other trans charities, such as Stonewall and Mermaids. The organisation is a business that offers training to staff in schools, colleges, universities and youth services. Without any democratic mandate, governmental organisations have sought its advice to shape the law and social policy. On 1st of December 2020, the High Court passed an historic judgment on the case of Keira Bell and Mrs A versus the Tavistock and PORTMAN NHS Foundation Trust. The judgment included a damning indictment of the clinical practices at the GIDS clinic at the Tavistock. On the 19th of January in 2021, the Tavistock was granted leave to appeal against the High Court decision. And on the 29th of January 2021, three charities, Gendered Intelligence, Brook and the Endocrine Society, were given permission to intervene in support of the Tavistock. The High Court decision was overturned on appeal, but the spotlight on the clinical practices led to the interim CAS report and the subsequent decision to close the Gender Identity Development Services Clinic. In August 2022, a letter was published in the British Psychological Society online journal, The Psychologist. The letter was signed by 14 clinicians. The letter stated, "The closure of the Gender Identity Development Service, GIDS, at the Tavistock has attracted significant public and media attention. Closure resulted from the CAS review of children and young people's gender services in England. The interim report recommended a new service model which acknowledges multiple routes in and out of gender dysphoria. Elevated rates of same-sex attraction, autism spectrum disorders, mental health issues, and looked after children were noted amongst the now majority female and hugely increased GIDS cohort." Dr. Cass reported that diagnostic overshadowing using gender as the primary clinical lens had led to such wider issues being relatively neglected. Inadequate records and data were highlighted, particularly regarding puberty blocker outcomes. The new model intends to recenter the young person's needs, taking a holistic view of their difficulties. In contrast, in an article published in The Guardian in November 2022, Cleo Madeline, a spokesperson for gendered intelligence, stated, "Left-handedness increased over time after we stopped punishing left-handed children in schools because some children are naturally left-handed and were now able to express it. In the same way, increased visibility and acceptance of trans people has led to a gradual increase in young people who feel comfortable expressing their trans identity. The most important thing is to recognize that this is not a problem to be solved or a bad outcome to be avoided. Other people believe that it is more likely that children are identifying as trans because of the influence of queer theory." The Welsh Government's highly influential LGBTQ+ expert panel recommend that gendered intelligence be employed in the design of resources for Welsh school teachers. Teachers in schools in the local authority areas of Bridgend, Cardiff, Merthyr, Rhondda Cynon Taf and Vale of Glamorgan will receive training from Brook. Brook, Gender Intelligence, Stonewall and the Welsh Government all recommend that children struggling with gender issues be socially affirmed. Meanwhile, the number of young people detransitioning is rapidly increasing. From January 2022 to February 2023, the number of people signed up to Detrans Reddit increased by 20,000. Rachel Reilly-Cooper ends her article with the following. To call yourself non-binary or gender fluid while demanding that others call themselves cisgender is to insist that the vast majority of humans must stay in their boxes because you identify as boxless. The solution is not to reify gender by insisting on ever more gender categories that define the complexity of human personality in rigid and essentialist ways. The solution is to abolish gender altogether. We do not need gender. We would be better off without it. Gender as a hierarchy with two positions operates to naturalize and perpetuate the subordination of female people to male people and constrains the development of individuals of both sexes. Reconceiving of gender as an identity spectrum represents no improvement. You do not need to have a deep, internal, essential experience of gender to be free to dress how you like, behave how you like, work how you like, love who you like. You do not need to show that your personality is feminine for it to be acceptable for you to enjoy cosmetics, cookery and crafting. You do not need to be gender queer to queer gender. The solution to an oppressive system that puts people into pink and blue boxes is not to create more and more boxes that are any colour but blue or pink. The solution is to tear down the boxes altogether. Of course, getting rid of the boxes does not meet the queer theory objective of changing language with the goal of undermining heteronormativity. With no references to the words boy, girl, male or female, man or woman in the RSE Code, but 17 references to the word gender, the Welsh Government are firmly intent on queering education. Parents who have concerns about the impact of queer theory doctrine on their children may consider supporting Public Child Protection Wales, who are appealing the judicial review judgment. Links are included below.